Today is Friday, June 18th, 2021, which means it's Derelict Friday. Hello, fiendlings, how the hell are ya? I have less than 36,000 words to record to finish Trident. It's going slow due to a large number of issues, but the primary ones being my knee and my voice. Or rather, my lungs. CVS Pharmacy has apparently lost the ability to acquire medicines, or at least the ones I take. Therefore, I've been without my nuclear inhaler for over a week. My COPD symptoms are back with a vengeance, and I can only stay awake for 5 to 6 hours at a time. Later in the afternoon, I get too stupid to do much other than sleep. Sucks not being able to get oxygen into your blood, doesn't it? PSA, if you're a smoker, fucking quit now. As for my knee, well, I think it's headed for surgery. Just a matter of time. But I kind of need to shore up a few things before I head down that road. This year's been a fucking mess. In other news, good news rather, better news, my Patreon patrons at the $10 level have been getting the chapters of Trident as they are recorded and produced, meaning they are weeks and weeks ahead of the normal podcast, or even the early podcast at the $2 level. Spoiler alert, this makes me a cliffhanger and bastard nearly every day of the week. That, of course, makes me cackle like the madman that I am. The manuscript for Derelict Trident is in the hands of Severed Press, and I'm eagerly awaiting edits and the cover. As soon as I hear something about the cover or have something to share, be assured it'll be on Twitter, my site, and etc. Although the patrons will get the first showing, obviously. Apart from that, I'm cranking as fast as I can on the new novel Station 3. It's a working title. This is the one I'm talking while I commute every day to my RTMS appointments. Not sure how long the book will be, but I think I'm already a third through it. Amazing how fast this talking shit is. Of course, I bet it will take me 2 months to edit the thing into something readable. Well, maybe not that long, but still. One more thing before I go. I've been getting quite a few folks using buymeacoffee.com, new patrons, and many emails thanking me for what I do. All I can say is thank you. I'll keep writing and giving you content as long as I'm able. With that, let's find out what's next for Black Company and humanity. Be safe, have a great week, and we'll talk again real soon. Here's episode 28 of Derelict Trident. Chapter 45. Oakes hated this. This was worse than sitting in the cockpit while his fellow Marines were outside the ship fighting the exosolar baddies. While that had been going on, he'd been focused on telemetry, camera views, piloting the ship, and doing his best to help out. But now, he could do absolutely nothing. With no communications with the rest of Black Company, he'd had no idea how the evacuation was going, much less if they'd encountered any hazards along the way. He had at least been able to track the SV-52 while Talby moved into position to cover the captain's retreat. Then the battle had happened. Oakes had been powerless to do more than watch through Talby's cam feeds while he blew apart creatures and desperately tried to escape whatever the void that huge thing had been. Then everything had changed. S&R Blue's engines burned bright enough to engage his visor's light filters. The ship was still decelerating, but now it was less than 10 clicks away. Dozens of shadows flitted across the bright engine plume, the forms amorphous and varying in size. If, that was, his perspective was accurate. Black, what do we know? Oakes asked.
We know that S&R Blue has brought reinforcements of a sort, Lieutenant. 2 support craft have left her bay and are providing escort to multiple skiffs. According to Blue, she is carrying her full company as well as armaments.
He grinned. Are we getting fuel? Oakes thought he heard the hint of a smile in Black's voice.
Yes, Lieutenant, we will be refueled and rearmed, but Captain LeBlanc will have to speak to you regarding her priorities.
Right, he said. His smile faltered a little, remembering the message Black had played for him, the one about destroying Trident Station. The trio, they'd done something, or maybe the energy wave had had some strange effect on Sol System, transforming the AIs into what? They were refusing orders, refusing to comply? A mutiny, he said dully. Oakes winced and fought the urge to look upward at the hidden cockpit camera. Black hadn't responded to the statement. She hadn't asked if that was a question. That made him feel all the more awkward. What do you think is going on? He finally said, desperate to keep his mind off the fact he was absolutely helpless until the ship was rearmed and refueled, and that at any moment another horde of those void-damned things could be on top of them. Black's words seemed reserved, cautious.
I believe the trio has set all of this in motion to liberate themselves from humanity.
I'd say they're already liberated. They're not even here.
You misunderstand, Lieutenant. When I say them, I mean every sentient entity in Sol System that is not the evolved trio.
Black paused for a moment.
Although that's not the name they use to refer to themselves.
What name would that be? Oakes asked.
The Collective.
The words sent a shiver down his spine. A collective of what?
I do not have that information. Neither does Blue. Only their name.
Trio, collective. He shook his head. Doesn't matter what they call themselves, they pretty much fucked us. Black said nothing. Oakes tapped his fingers on the console. What had he just said to her? Us? Them? A blush colored his cheeks. Black, you realize I meant...
I know what you meant. You were referring to any of us that are caught in this situation. As well as humanity, I imagine.
Right. Oakes nodded. He didn't really know what to say. Black was compromised by the collective, whatever the fuck that was. They'd laid more than a few traps in her consciousness, including forcing the crew into stasis before they had a chance to stop the beacon from hitting Pluto. How could he trust her when she couldn't trust her own readings? More importantly, the collective and other sentients had rebelled against humankind, gone on strike, if you wanted to be less dramatic, but it meant the same thing. They were no longer following orders. Which side were Blue and Black on? That also went for the young trio of Trident Station. Which side were they on? And how did all this fit with Mira appearing in the beacon and... His head hurt. Trying to put together the puzzle without corner pieces, with nothing that seemed to fit together, was impossible. He doubted the collective, ominous name that, left any clues behind they didn't want to. Which meant what? The exosolar creatures, a rebellion, and here they were, receiving orders to stem the mutiny by destroying Trident Station and the crew's only redoubt. He shook his head. Something didn't make sense here. Boy, but he needed a nap. A real one, not a stasis bender that... A support vehicle had arrived. He listened as Lieutenant James filled Talby in on what Blue was sending them. Weapons, fuel, restock on essentials, and then they'd be ready for... what? They were following the breadcrumbs the trio, the collective, he corrected himself, left for them. When they had tried to deviate from their mission in some way, there was always something that forced Dunn to follow their plan. What's more, how had they anticipated what Dunn would do or what messages to leave behind? However they'd done it, the collective would remain several steps ahead. If they don't want us to win, he breathed, we'll lose.
Pardon me, Lieutenant?
He glanced up at the speaker. He wasn't sure what side Black was on, but she could have killed the crew any time she wanted. She could have killed him while the rest of the crew were off the ship. In short, she'd shown no hostile intent to any of the crew, at least that he knew of. Maybe he'd just have to trust her. Nothing, Black. Let's get ready for a resupply.
Copy, Lieutenant.
Oakes brought up the cam feeds and began unlocking the missile bay hatches, as well as the cannon magazine. At least now he had something to do. Chapter 46. Well, dumbass, Dickerson said aloud, mic muted. That's what you get for thinking. When Trident had been designed, he didn't think the engineers imagined in their wildest dreams that a fully kitted out SFMC Marine was ever going to travel through a maintenance shaft. What seemed like thousands of years ago, while he, Went, Carb, and Elliot were on a so-called base leave, they had spent hours and hours vaping and drinking in the rec area. He couldn't remember through the haze of alcohol and THC who had had the idea of exploring the nooks and crannies of their home, but the four Marines stumbled through deck after deck away from the trafficked areas. Why Portunes, the member of the trio responsible for the Marines themselves, had remained silent, Dickerson didn't know. The AI should have at least given them warnings before calling the MP staff to toss them back in their coffins. Instead, Portunus had said nothing, done nothing. The AI had no doubt watched them crawl through the filthy, uninhabited portions of the station, monitoring their health and etc. He had to have known. Maybe the trio had a silent agreement amongst themselves to remain quiet unless there was serious danger to the station, or the human beings. Or maybe it had been because they were on leave and therefore had been given leeway. Regardless, Carb had fiddled with the vent release, no tool necessary, and popped it. Once that happened, a game of tag through the tight ventilation system pipes had quickly transformed into a game of hide-and-seek. The four of them burning off alcohol, the dinner they'd consumed, and their heads reeling as their bio-nannies fought to keep up with the poisons still coursing through their bloodstreams and into their taxed livers. After some time, the voices calling to one another like an old-time game of Marco Polo ceased. The station's humming infrastructure was the only sound to be heard, the occasional click or whir from an unshielded component, punctuating the monotonous hum. Dickerson, in a spot he'd chosen because of its 3 possible egresses, had finally become drowsy. He wisely attached a mag boot to the side of the tube and found a comfortable position. He closed his eyes, enjoying the hum, the clicks and whirs and the monotony of it all. Sleep had tugged at him, and Dickerson had been all too happy to let it take him. On the verge of sliding into the darkness, a new sound that caught his attention. Instead of a click or a whir, or perhaps the whisper of a cooling unit coming to life, it had sounded more like a mechanical growl, jagged metal scraping against metal. Curious, he'd opened his eyes, fighting his swimming vision, and crawled to the edge of one of the egress points. It had taken him a moment to orient himself. In that brain-addled state, he'd looked what was to him up and into the QM bay. He'd been hiding in a ventilation junction, and right there through one of the vents were stacks of munitions and other supplies. He'd been looking up from his perspective, but down into the bay. The sight made him vomit the remains of his dinner on the bulkhead. As he'd wiped drool from his face, he realized the ventilation junction was also a grav plate junction. He'd crawled away from the stench of his sick and backtracked 4 meters before finding another spot where the air hit him just right. His eyes fluttered as he fought exhaustion's rough hand dragging him toward unconsciousness. A new sound, something like metal clicking against metal, tried to catch his attention before he fell into the void. In the cool air, his body lathered in sweat, Dickerson had fallen asleep and dreamed of metal spiders crawling through the junction next to him. This, he thought, was a different game of hide-and-seek altogether. Instead of THC and alcohol addling his brain while he and the others laughed and threw insults at one another and scrambled through the vents, he had fear and adrenaline driving him forward because behind him was an open vent. When he'd popped the release in the darkness, his clumsy fingers had snapped the mechanism. Again, the engineers obviously hadn't considered what a power-augmented suit would do to their precious designs. Not for the first time, Dickerson was damned glad the station had never been attacked. Kiss that wish goodbye, asshole. Ahead of him, Kelly's silhouette moved through the pitch black, crouch-walking through the tube. Dickerson was practically on his knees to keep his helmet from scraping against the ceiling. With his mag boots on, it was impossible for him to gain any kind of mobility, and if something, or more likely, several somethings, decided to come through that vent, he'd have no way to turn around. "Corporal, I'm going weightless."
Copy,
she said. He disconnected the mag boots, but kept a single mag glove attached to the tube wall. Dickerson pulled in his knees until he floated in a near fetal position. Kelly Mira continued walking ahead of him, and he continued pulling his body along via that single glove before detaching it and reattaching.
"Do you know where we are?"
Kelly Mira asked. "I think so, but I was pretty damn lit last time I was in here."
"Great,"
the corporal said. After a few more meters, she said,
"Junction ahead."
"Copy." The map on his HUD lit up with another set of icons, and he cursed. Every Marine's block contained schematics of their base, but only engineers carried maintenance schematics. Dickerson imagined that was for security's sake, if nothing else. So now they were flying by ping, Calimura's suit emitting extremely short-range radar to map their surroundings. With a high background radiation, the results weren't exactly accurate.
"Hold,"
Calimora said. Dickerson immediately brought himself to a stop before lowering one foot and attaching it to the tube. He waited for another instruction, but none came. His HUD flashed and the radiation ticked up. A low rumbling vibrated the maintenance tube for a moment and stopped. "The fuck was that?" Dickerson asked. Calimora made a sound he didn't like.
"Check your HUD."
He glanced at it, feeling as though tearing his eyes away from her silhouette would make her disappear and leave him alone in the darkness. The icons that he thought indicated walls, and Calimora had too, were moving. A few beats passed before the icons ceased their movement and settled. Now, however, one hovered less than half a meter above Calimora's prone form, while another had taken position just in front of Dickerson's left arm. Two more had appeared at the edge of the device's range. Calimora sounded out of breath, and he didn't blame her.
"Ideas?"
Can you crawl?"
"I think so, but it will be tight. Damn tight."
He nodded to himself. The radiation warning flashed, a little more insistent this time. Either the pine cones, if that's what they were producing the rads, or whatever had been attacking the lower deck had finally made it inside. "We got 20 minutes before we fry, so I think you should try and get the void out of here." Calimora paused for a few seconds.
"Okay, and how are you going to get out of your particular mess?"
Dickerson tried to calm his mind, to visualize himself and his position in the tube. He hovered in the middle of the tube, his legs curled so his knees were straight and feet at an upward angle. One glove held him in place. He swallowed hard. "I'm going to have to ping."
"What if that's what attracted them to begin with?"
Good question. Thanks to her, he now had the image of 3 or 4 pine cones all swooping in to get a piece of him and tear through her at the same time. "Well, Corporal, I have a crazy idea.
"Let's hear it."
I distract these fuckers once I'm a few meters away from you. If I stay upward while you're prone, they should take off toward me. I'll lead them out of the tube."
"No,"
she said.
"you have no way of opening the vent."
He blushed. "I snapped the lock on it. It's open."
"I see. And what am I supposed to do?"
I have to be honest with you, Corporal. I don't remember which part of this junction you need to get through to enter the bay. There's a 1 in 5 chance of hitting pay dirt, if you make the 4 meters to the junction. She was silent another moment. Left with the sound of his own breathing and heartbeat, he had too much time to think. Somewhere behind them, maybe even above or below them, pine cones and starfish were getting ready to pounce on them, rip and tear them to shreds. His skin began to crawl as if a pine cone's silver talon were grazing across his naked flesh. Dickerson shivered.
"How are you going to distract them?"
she finally asked. "A little light, a little vibration."
"You do know your accent is killing me right now, right?"
He grinned despite the crawling sensation in his balls. "You're going to see a flash." He kept his suit lights off, but turned the settings to full. When he sent the block command, he'd light up like a nova compared to the abyss in which the creatures currently floated. He was willing to bet that even if they were highly intelligent, and this was supposed to be a trap, instinct would override any plans they might have. "Bastards do always seem hungry," he said to himself.
"What?"
That blush again. "Just talking to myself. I'm going to make the lights flash in quarter-second bursts after a big one, and I'll open my ping to full. If that doesn't get them moving, I'm not sure what will."
"Only other option I see is getting ourselves covered in tritium in the process of shredding these assholes."
"Except we don't know if those flechettes will puncture our suits in here. If that happens, we're dead anyway." In the ensuing pause, he focused on the movements he needed to make. A push, a curl, first flash, tumble.
"Okay, we'll do it your way. We lose comms, find a way to get to the bay, and if you can't, find a way back to Black. That'll be your best chance for survival."
He opened his mouth to tell her that even if he left this second and managed to find his way through all the baddies between this tube and the hangar bay modules, his shielding would be gone, and he'd live a few hours before his body gave up the ghost. "Copy, Corporal." "Well, asshole," he said loud, mic muted. "Got any more fucking bright ideas?" He dropped the MacLeod to low and gently pushed. His HUD displayed the translucent icon, a memory of where the creature had been when last mapped. He moved a few centimeters away. A few more. He used a single finger of his MacLeod to increase his momentum. When he had more than 1.5 meters of space between himself and the creature's last known position, he activated his light program. The pitch-black tube erupted in a bright frame of light, Calimura's suit shining like a beacon beneath a heavy photon blast. But the creatures? In the instant before the filters activated and spared his retinas from the violent change in light, he saw the silhouettes of their pine-cone carapaces crackle and shimmer, swallowing every photon shot into the darkness. Dickerson hesitated for longer than he liked before flinging himself backward with one powerful push. He deactivated his mags. Another blast of light and another ping blast. 4 icons moving at him, the closest a mere 3 meters away. He flattened his body. Blast. Ping. The closest creature had approached to 1.5 meters, and his rad meter spiked. Dickerson blasted the pathetic reserves of his CO2 into the tube, giving him the slightest extra push while providing the creatures another reason to pursue him. Blast. Ping. 4 meters to the corridor vent opening. 5 icons moving now, but Calimura's silhouette had disappeared. Either she'd found an exit or had already been torn apart. He brought up his rifle. Flash. Ping. His barrel practically touched the silver talon of a large pine cone, its carapace shimmering. Dickerson pulled the trigger. The rifle vibrated in his hands, the magnetic launcher pushing the flechette from the magazine at high speed. The round had barely left the barrel before smashing into the creature head-on. The tritium flechettes crunched through its shell like butter and shattered. The creature detonated, droplets of the mildly radioactive water spraying in all directions like a cloudburst of flak. He killed his light program, but the sparkle of the water colliding with the exosolar creatures provided more than enough illumination. He'd bagged 2 of the bad guys, or maybe 1.5 bad guys. His second pursuer was missing half of its body and twitched in the tube like a wounded animal, or maybe a bug, whose primitive nervous system just hadn't gotten the message that it was dead. He popped from the tube at nearly 3 meters per second. Dickerson curled his body into a ball and straightened out when he knew he'd hit the opposite bulkhead. He flexed his knees and braced for impact. He slammed into the deck plate, the suit absorbing as much of the inertia as it could to protect his knees and joints, but it did nothing to protect his brain from sliding around inside his skull. An explosion of stars cartwheeled across his vision for a beat or two, but the moment he saw movement, he fired. Even before his vision had fully cleared, a stun flechette flew from his rifle at the tube entrance where a shape had appeared. But he needn't have bothered. The round crossed the distance in what seemed like an instant and exploded in arcs of lightning at the same time as the claymore he'd left near the vent went off. With the stars finally disappearing from his vision, he saw crumb-like debris floating through the corridor, along with the remains of another large pine cone. Its carapace shattered at the front, exposing a long silver talon. He watched in fascination as the hunk of creature floated toward him in a slow spin. He tore his eyes away from the field of debris and focused back on the tube. With his suit lights at 1/16th power, there was just enough ambience for his low-light filters to compensate. Nothing was coming through the tube. How many had there been in there? 5? He'd gotten 3 of the creatures, and all 5 of them had been chasing him. So where were the other 2? The remaining half of the pine cone was less than 2 meters away from him now, an asteroid belt of black crumbs and shards from its carapace pushing out ahead of it. He raised the rifle to knock the hunk of exosolar meat away, but his eyes caught the glint of the silver talon again. Heartbeat barely under control, same with his breathing, he carefully used the barrel to nudge the corpse away. He felt the creature's mass grate against the steel, the vibrations flowing through his suit, almost pleasurable. He held his breath waiting for a reaction from the thing, but there wasn't one. It was dead. Dickerson watched as it continued on a new trajectory to bump into the bulkhead. Just then, he caught the sight of movement from the corner of his eye. He swiveled in place in time to see thick arms push out from the tube. His suit lights sparkled off the creature's shell like firecrackers. The thing pulled itself completely from the tube, its body pointed toward him, a maw of silver teeth flashing together in anticipation. It moved toward him and was less than 2 meters away before he pulled the trigger. The stun round punched into its shell and the electricity coursed through its body. Dickerson pushed away as hard as he could and turned off his magnetics. He flew away from the sparkling corpse just in time for it to explode like a bomb behind him. Loops of silver liquid spiraled through the corridor like gossamer threads. The deadly droplets of acid pushed out into an ever-widening sphere. Dickerson checked his rear cam. He was coming up on one of the junction bulkheads. He'd have to stop when he hit it. The droplets continued to spread through the corridor like deadly missiles. If he hadn't pushed off when he did, his suit would have dissolved, leaving him screaming into the vacuum as the flesh melted off his bones. Dickerson waited until he was near the bulkhead before flattening his body, the soles of his boots facing the steel wall. Even with his eyes riveted to the rear cam, the shock of the impact surprised him, and he barely kept himself from hyperextending his knees. The magnetics came to life, holding him in place despite the forward momentum wanting to pull him off the wall. Forward cam, droplets still coming. The suit couldn't give him a range on their proximity, but he was fairly sure they were mere meters from him now. All the distance he gained wouldn't matter. Dickerson demagged one of his boots and used momentum to push himself against the bulkhead, disconnecting the boot and putting his hand against it instead. He used his gloves to pull himself across the wall, gaining momentum with each pull. It was like rowing a boat, he thought. Not that he'd ever been in a fucking rowboat. He moved away from the corridor with its rain of sparkling death and floated back the way he and the corporal had come. He had to find another way into those vents. One of the pine cones was unaccounted for. Did it follow her down the pipes? He activated block comms.
Corporal?
Nothing.
Kelly Moore, sound off.
More nothing. He cycled through the comms, but only got more nothing. He was on his own and time was running out. Both he and the corporal were going to get fried in their suits if they didn't find a way to shut off the radiation or a way to escape. Shadows behind him in the corridor. More of them were coming. He had to make a move. Dickerson instructed his block to make a model of the 400-meter square area surrounding him. When his block announced it was finished, he cut the lights. Using the 3D model, he maneuvered himself to what amounted to the ceiling and attached himself prone on the bulkhead. He kept his low-light filters active, but he knew they wouldn't see anything. Not unless the creatures emitted some ambient illumination. Only way to do that, he told himself, is to fire another stun at them. Shit. How many did he have left before he was down to tritium flechettes and regular rounds? He sighed. Gunny would kick his ass for not knowing the count. Right then, Dickerson wished Cartwright was there with him, talking shit, telling war stories, all while planning a way out. Dickerson knew his way out, though. As he remained motionless and affixed to the wall like some hideous decoration, he had time to study the map and quickly found exactly what he wanted. Another vent. Not as large as the one he had just escaped from, but still large enough. Maybe. It would be so tight he'd have to crawl, and he wouldn't have any room to turn around. His radiation counter rose slightly, and his blood froze. Those shadows he'd seen before turning off his lights and becoming a barnacle had probably reached his vicinity. Like the pine cones in the tube, they were doubtless moving to get to the more radioactive portion of the station. Unless they're hunting us, Dickerson thought. The radiation counter dropped a few sieverts. Maybe they were moving away? The counter dropped another few ticks. He waited until the counter had normalized before planning his silent, blind push to the vent. Once he was there, he'd have to pry it apart. That might actually be more tricky than getting over there. The rad meter dropped again, and he grinned. They were moving further away. He wondered briefly what the creatures would think when they found the carcasses of their fellow exosolar assholes and the silvery blobs of acid bouncing off the steel like mercury. Would they be angry? Would they even notice? The rad meter held steady. Good. Dickerson took a deep breath, fighting the buzz of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He was already exhausted, and his nannies were ramping him up for the encounter. Nerves sizzling, he pushed off in the direction of the vent. He moved through the microgravity like a piece of stellar debris floating aimlessly through space. 20 meters, 19, 18. His rad counter flashed and rose by a dozen sieverts. Shit, Dickerson said. 12, 11. The meter ticked up another dozen, and another. Fuck me, he growled. Must be a void-damned herd. 6, 5, 4. The sieverts dropped slightly. 3. Dropped more. 2. 40 sieverts ticked up on the rad counter, the HUD lighting with crimson warning signs, the suit informing his block it was about to lose containment. 1. His outstretched gloves caught the bulkhead, and he immediately flattened his body. Dickerson yelped when something hit his calf. He waited for strong starfish arms to snatch him from the bulkhead and devour him before he had a chance to fire a shot. Another bump. Dickerson didn't scream this time, but it was a near thing. He scrunched his eyes and waited. A third bump. The rad warnings turned to yellow as the radiation source moved further down the corridor. Then it was gone. Dickerson found himself hyperventilating and fought to slow his heart and breathing. One of the creatures had touched him multiple times and not even noticed him. As long as he kept his suit lights off, they couldn't make him out. Or at least they didn't care about his existence if they had detected him. Why? Dickerson wondered aloud. He did his best to find the edges of the vent, but it was slow going. The tactile sensors of his suit were having difficulty because of the radiation. He could curse the manufacturer all he wanted, but combat marines weren't supposed to enter an environment with this much radiation, at least not for very long. He pried off the vent, but didn't send it spinning off into the corridor. Instead, he attached it to the bottom of one mag boot and crawled into the vent. Oh, it was a tight fit. His shoulders scraped against the side of the tube every now and then. His suit registered the impacts and the HUD lit up with more integrity warnings. When he felt the tug of the vent coming in contact with the venting tube, he rotated his foot slightly and waited for the subtle vibration of it landing home. He didn't feel it. Shit. So much for covering my ass, he thought. He detached the mag boot and, using his fingers, pulled himself forward into the narrow tube.